Ken Wilber, welcome to the Seekers Forum. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and it's delightful to see you again as well.
Thanks. You know, you have written that authentic spirituality is revolutionary. It does not legitimate the world, it breaks the world. It does not console the world, it shatters it. And it does not render the self content, it renders it undone.
Right.
To me, there is no better definition of crazy wisdom than that.
Right.
So can you talk about the benefits of crazy wisdom, its unique power, and what we can learn from it?
Sure. I suppose I would start by pointing out that spiritual traditions, even very good ones, like original Buddhism or Theravada, or it's sometimes called Hinayana, which is a derogatory term that means small vehicle. And it's small for a simple reason. It separated nirvana from samsara. And it saw all of samsara as dukkha, or suffering. And you are to get out of samsara by getting into nirvana, which is a complete space of freedom from all manifestation, freedom from all duality, and so on. The problem with that nirvana versus samsara, or emptiness versus form, is that it is ultimately dualistic. It does divide the world into a nirvana, which is real, and a samsara, which is illusory. So we don't find a major difference in Buddhism for around 600 years until the arisal of a genius named Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna is credited with founding Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana is a Sanskrit term which means big vehicle. So Mahayana was contracted with Hinayana, contrasted with Hinayana, which was small vehicle. And Mahayana claimed it didn't deny nirvana. And nirvana is a very real state. And we saw examples of this state during the Vietnam War, where monks who were protesting the war sat in meditation, got into nirvana, which also terms used for nirvana are nirod, which means no thinking, and nirvikalpa, which means cessation of thought. And they would get into this state of nirod, nirvikalpa, nirvana, where all of manifestation is blotted out. They would then be poured, doused in gasoline, and set on fire. And right on live TV, in front of millions of people, they burned to the ground in ashes, and not one of them flinched once. Nirvana is a very real state. And in the overall system of states used by both Vedanta and Vajrayana, Vajrayana is the school that came after Mahayana, although it's often considered a form of Mahayana because it also does not divide samsara and nirvana. But the state of Mahayana, the way Nagarjuna presented it, does not divide nirvana and samsara. So, as the Heart Sutra would soon put it, that which is emptiness is not other than form. That which is form is not other than emptiness. And that was another way of saying that which is nirvana is not other than samsara. That which is samsara is not other than nirvana. So what they're doing is finding a deeper wholeness, a deeper fullness than just nirvana, which was a whole and was real, as we just saw, but it still was a case of self-absorption. And so the hero of the Hinayana approach was known as an erhard. And an erhard is somebody who retreats into a cave, a solitary realizer, and just meditates by themselves until they're perfectly in nirvana. And so that means they won't have any pain, they won't have any suffering, they won't have any ego. And again, all of those are true, but they're all excluding the entire manifest realm. And Nagarjuna comes along and says, okay, nirvana is real, but it's not the most real. There's a state that actually takes nirvana and includes it with samsara. And he called that state shunyata, which is Sanskrit that literally means emptiness, but it's not clearly not the type of emptiness that is different from form. It's an emptiness that includes form. That which is emptiness is not other than form. That which is form is not other than emptiness. And so the way this comes about is through an even deeper transformation of consciousness into this non-dual state. And that's what shunyata really meant, was a non-duality. So the way Nagarjuna expresses that is by saying, whatever this non-dual state is, you can't think it. And by that, he means ordinary thought operates by opposites, basically. It's good versus evil, pleasure versus pain, suffering versus not suffering, up versus down. I mean, whatever you think about, you're thinking in terms of opposites. And Nagarjuna says, this is so whole that you can't think it in terms of opposites. And he comes up with a very specific formula that shows just how ridiculous thought is if it tries to grasp a dual reality or shunyata. He says, take X and let X represent any word you think applies to ultimate reality. It can be God, it can be spirit, it can be the infinite, it can be consciousness, it can be the good, the true, the beautiful, any term you want. And real reality is neither X nor non-X, nor both, nor neither. That rather takes out the thought aspect of this ultimate non-dual reality. So you might say spirit is truth. And Nagarjuna says spirit is neither truth, nor non-truth, nor both, nor neither. So show me, if you're a Zen master, you say, okay, show me this truth right now. And you would have to come up with something that would satisfy the Zen master. So those typically are known as koans. And a famous koan is, for example, show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. Now, I'll explain what that means in a moment, but you get the point. No amount of simply thinking about this is going to work. So there goes theology, there goes metaphysics, there goes all of those thought processes that are going to get you to the absolute. So according to Nagarjuna, there is a way to discover this absolute. And that is through a deep, deep process of meditation. And so we can't get it with our ordinary thinking mind, but we can get it if we transform our thinking mind into this higher state of consciousness. And once we do that, then what this absolute non-dual reality is becomes obvious. The idea is that subject and object become one. They're part of what becomes non-dual. And so you as subject are looking at the world of samsara out there that are all objects, or Maya, or illusion, or however you want to conceive it. And all of a sudden, this subject drops and you become one with everything you're looking at. It's sometimes called cosmic consciousness because you feel you're one with the entire universe. And that's how it feels. You actually, when you feel yourself, you feel everything that you're aware of. And so, and that includes when you feel, who am I? The answer is, I'm the entire universe. I'm one with all of it. And that's the important point Nagarjuna was trying to make. And something that's one with everything, obviously no opposites will explain it. Because opposites only explain half the universe. It's either good or it's evil, or it's up or it's down, or it's pleasure or it's pain, or something like that. So no amount of words will describe this utter absolute wholeness that the universe is and that you are. So all of this is sort of a discussion about Nagarjuna and what he came up with. And to put it in words, which will not be accurate, as we discussed, but the point is everything is spirit. There is nothing but spirit. That's why nirvana and samsara are one, because they're just two sides of the same spiritual reality. And this is leading up to crazy wisdom. In Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the Buddhism that came after Mahayana Buddhism, but is often considered a subset of Mahayana Buddhism because it's part of big Buddhism, and it believes in the unity of nirvana and samsara. It doesn't believe that nirvana is, that samsara is all rotten and is all dukkha or suffering, and that nirvana is all good. It sees them as unified realities. And so that's because there is only spirit. Spirit is the only thing that exists. Literally, wherever you look, or whatever you're feeling, good, bad, indifferent, those are all just opposites. And under all of those opposites lies reality, a wholeness, a perfect, absolute oneness with everything. And so the typical instructions on a path of Vajrayana are bring everything to the path. So that would be unlike Hinayana, where if you have anger come up, you're supposed to use all sorts of antidotes to anger. You're not supposed to have anger. That's part of samsara. You want to get rid of that. And particularly almost every religion around the world said sex, no sex. Sex is bad. Sex detracts you from spirit. Mahayana and Vajrayana wouldn't say that. They would say bring everything to the path. And that means bring everything that's typically denied religion, bring that to your religion. And their initiation ceremonies actually contained what's called the 5 M's. And the 5 M's are simply 5 Sanskrit words. They all happen to begin with the letter M. And so they're called the 5 M's. But they include red meat, sex, parched grain, alcohol. The 5 things that virtually every other religion at all times has said is bad. Well, there's no bad in Vajrayana. And a takeoff of that was Tantra. And Tantra used sex to gain enlightenment. It not only didn't see sex as the opposite of spirit, it saw sex as a direct road to spirit, because ultimately they're not two. So sexual Tantra, Vajrayana, Mahayana have this understanding that there's only spirit, bring everything to the path, and that in terms of your ordinary thinking, it's neither X nor not X, nor both, nor neither. So that becomes, that bring everything to the path, where there is only spirit, becomes the real basis of a crazy wisdom. Because crazy wisdom is crazy because it seems to include all sorts of things that you wouldn't ordinarily include. It's crazy that way. Well, that's why. Because as crazy wisdom gets, and as many wild and insane things as it wants to bring, they're all nothing but spirit. And so if you are going about your spiritual practice in a way that's trying to exclude various items, maybe exclude self, exclude envy, exclude jealousy, exclude anger, exclude sex, any of those, all of those are brought to the path with Vajrayana and Tantra. And so the initiation ceremonies of Vajrayana, where you actually introduced to the path, they actually include eating red meat, for example, and having sex, for example. And they're really serious about including the sex part. And sex is also becomes a part of your ordinary everyday practice. And that marks it very, very different, because almost every other mysticism, mystical path that I'm aware of, and that includes nature mysticism, deity mysticism, formless mysticism, and even Turiya mysticism, includes celibacy at some point, because it's just not allowed. It's going to be a detraction from your spiritual realization. And according to Vajrayana and Tantra, it's not. It's just not. And that's crazy wisdom. So crazy wisdom can include alcohol, and so Trungpa Rinpoche was a famous alcoholic, and he was crazy wisdom adept. People, by the way, that would meet Trungpa would say, particularly towards the end of his life, where a subtotal of drinking had finally caught up with him, they would say his body looked horrible, but his mind was just sharp as a tack and stayed that way. So that's just, who knows, but that's an example of what crazy wisdom can do.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
That's basically crazy wisdom, and that's its history, and that's what it fundamentally means. Bring everything to the path.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a slippery slope, isn't it? It's a slippery slope for teachers, and it's a slippery slope as a practitioner, isn't it? It's very easy for the ego to co-opt that process.
Right. And if you're doing it correctly, you'll bring that ego and its corruption to the path.
How do we do that?
Well, it's just like, let's say, the meditative process of witnessing. And witnessing is a very, very high state of consciousness. If you look at, as I started to say, the 5 main states of both Vedanta and Vajrayana. And by the way, when a Hindu tradition agrees with a Buddhist tradition, you've probably got something close to the word of God. I mean, it's just very rare that But they both say there are 5 major states of consciousness, and we're all born with all of them. But the 5 are waking, which just means average egoic waking, and then dreaming, and then deep sleep, which is called a formless state because it is formless. It's very close to the original meaning of nirvana, where everything is a cessation or comes to a halt. And those are all relative states of consciousness because they come a while, they stay a while, and they go a while. They all exist in time, and they're all relative. Then the 2 highest non-relative states are called Turiya, which just is Sanskrit for the 4th, and it's called the 4th because there are 3 before it: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. So this is just called the 4th. Not terribly imaginative or not a very literary name, but that's what it's called. And the 5th is not much better. It's called Turiyatita, which just means beyond the 4th. Now the 4th is the pure self it's sort of the pure nirvanic self. It's without any identification with anything that's arising. And that's the pure witness. And then Turiyatita, the 5th and highest state, is, the Tibetans call it one taste, because that's a name for being one with everything. So in one taste, the witness, 4th state, collapses into everything that it witnesses. And therefore you get a one taste. I am the stars. I don't see the stars. I am the mountain. I don't see the mountain. So those are the 4 typical states of consciousness that you can have. And in the witness, you're just supposed to witness everything that arises. And this is a very high state. Ramana Maharshi used to use this as his main practice. Inquire, who am I? And you'll find that you have a small I, which is you can see and you're aware of, and it's your ego, and you can think what it's thinking, see what it's seeing, and all of that. And then beyond that small self was what Ramana Maharshi called the I hyphen I, or what's the I that's aware of that small I. And that's your real self. So when you, like if I would say, write down on a sheet of paper everything you are, you might write things like, well, I'm this years old, I weigh this much, I got this much education, I work at this job, I see this girl, I have this girlfriend, I have 2 dogs, I like these kinds of movies, I like these kinds of books. And you might write down all these things that you think you are. But notice when you're doing that, there's a seer, and then there's these things seen. Well, all the things seen are your ego, are your object self. They're not your real self. They're not the real seer. They're just things that are seen. So you want to start your meditation, witnessing meditation practice, by just resting as the witness and let anything that wants to arise, arise. Just all of it. Now, this is to answer your question. So what if part of what arises is your ego? Well, witness that. What if part of what arises is some negative emotion or even some thought, I can't do this witnessing right? Just be aware of that thought. And that's the witness. In other words, you can't get the witness wrong. Whatever arises is fine. And once you realize that, you can kind of relax into, okay, I can start doing this. And you'll start doing it. You go, oh, I lost track of it. That's okay. Just be aware of the fact that you lost track of it. and you're back in the witness. So that's how you can bring everything to the path. And that's a sort of response to your question, how do you do this?
And for a teacher, I mean, doesn't the teacher have to do a lot of cleaning up before he or she is able to communicate this potentially destructive, negatively destructive kind of practice?
Right. And this is where I somewhat differ from the great traditions. And this I started working on this when I was in my 20s. I just read my first book when I was 23. It was called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And I drew heavily on the perennial philosophy, as it was called at that time, which was a group of very smart thinkers that felt the core of all religions, Christianity, Judaism, Sufism, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, the core of all of them met at this dome that they generally called emptiness. And they sort of meant it the way Nagarjuna meant it, but they also meant it in just the ordinary sense of there's just nothing. It's just a vast openness, a vast, wide openness. And that was God. And so all the religions, as they go up the side of the mountain, they all look different. They all have different paths. They all have different mythologies. They all have different practices. But the closer you got to the top of the mountain, the more they all looked very similar. So, and that part is relatively true, because you can look at Christian mysticism, for example, and on the lower levels, it's all about, well, I have to accept Christ. I have to let Christ into my life. God is light, and so on. And when you get to the very top, you find that things like the cloud of unknowing. And unknowing is used almost in the same sense that Nagarjuna used it. You can't say X or not X or both or neither. So you'll see page after page saying things like God is not light, God is not goodness, God is not being. And if you're reading that for the first time, it's kind of like, what? God is not the good and the true and the beautiful? No, because those are just words. And so they want you to get to this vast emptiness that is the witness. And the witness is empty of any objects, of anything that can be seen is not the seer. Anything that can be known is not the true knower. Anything that can be felt is not the true feeler. So if you think, feel, or know that God is light, that's got to go. That's not allowed. And so you find that kind of talk in every major religion. You find it in Sufism, you find it in contemplative Taoism, you certainly find it in Christianity and in Buddhism. And so I started with that general assumption. And it's still true, I think, in the sense that you can find among virtually every major religion something like the cloud of unknown or some mystical teaching that has you transcend everything that you think you're aware of until you just get to this vast emptiness, which when you look at it closely includes everything. The entire universe. It's cosmic consciousness, as they call it. And so I believed that, and I still believe it as a part of my belief system. But the more I started studying things like developmental psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis, the more it became obvious to me that neither of those two things were included in any major religion anywhere. So when it comes to what I call growing up, the stages of development that developmental psychology discovered, going back only about 100 years to an American genius named James Mark Baldwin. And James Mark Baldwin was a friend and colleague of William James. They both taught at Harvard. And what's interesting is that while James was exploring states of consciousness that led to mystical experience, James Mark Baldwin was discovering structures of consciousness that led to growing up. And they're two different processes. Growing up is a series of stages that every human being goes through. And there are many, many different names for these stages and all of that. I'll just give, as one simple example, the stages that Gene Gebser used when he started studying this growing up process. And he called them the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rational stage, the pluralistic stage, and the integral stage. And those are stages that every human being grows through or has a chance to grow through in their lifetime. And those turn out to be incredibly important. Let's say taking the move from magic to mythic, or from what's called pre-operational to what's called concrete operational thinking. In pre-operational thinking, the magic stage, the second of these 6 or so stages. So it's a very low stage. And it can't even take the role of other. So an example of that is what Piaget called the 2-ball experiment. You take a ball colored on one side red and green on the other, and you put it between you and the magical pre-operational child, it's probably around age 2 or so, and you spin the ball several times so it can see it's red on one side, green on the other. Then you stop the ball with the green side facing the child, and you're looking at the red side. And you ask the child, what color are you seeing? The child will correctly say green. You say, right. What color am I seeing? And the child will say green. It can't understand that you're seeing red, that you have a different perspective than it does. And so then when it gets to mythic, sometimes called mythic literal, because they're very concretely taken to be real. Zeus is real. Aphrodite is real. Santa Claus is real. The tooth fairy is real. You really believe these. And that's why James Fowler in his research called this the mythic literal stage. All the myths are taken to be literally true. But you do get an important advance as you move from magic into mythic. And that is this time that you take the ball, put it between you and the child and spin it. When it's looking at the green side, you say, what side are you seeing? It will correctly say green. When you say, what color am I seeing? It will correctly say red. It can understand that you have a different perspective than it does. And so when you get to that stage, you expand from what's called an egocentric or self-centered stage, which all the magic pre-operational stages are, to what's called an ethnocentric. Because you can take the role of other, you start to realize you have to fit in with a whole world of different perspectives. And so that leads to what that I said there are many names for these stages. One of the most common is a conformist stage, because that's what happens. You find that the best way to fit in with other people is simply to conform to the rules of society. And that's what happens. if you continue growing and move into the rational stage, then you can start to see a third person perspective. You can start to understand not only that you're one with a certain large group of people, but that you're really one with all people worldwide. And this caused a huge shift in how humanity started to look at itself. Among other things, at magic and mythic, slavery is perfectly okay. And so we had slavery from the beginning of time all the way through the magic era, which started about 50,000 years ago, through the mythic era, which started about 10,000 BC and went up to around 1500 AD, or as it's called, CE, Common Era. And the Western Enlightenment began to emerge. And what the Western Enlightenment was the emergence of rationality from this growing up stage. So remember, archaic to magic to mythic to rational. And starting about 300 years ago, the rational stage started to emerge in the West. And that brought not only the emergence of all the modern sciences, just suddenly they just came from nowhere. Modern physics, modern chemistry, modern geology, modern astronomy, all of them just burst on the scene in a couple 100-year period. Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Francis Bacon. I mean, you can just go through a whole list, and they all came with the emergence of this rational level, which was called the modern stage. And that modern stage continued until about 1960, when the pluralistic stage began to emerge, and we call that postmodernity. Now, the other thing that happened when rationality emerged is humanity got rid of slavery. Now, if you think about that, that's only about 200 years ago. And we've been on this planet, Homo sapiens, that is the modern form of humans, had been on this planet since about 300,000 years BCE. And it took us until just 200 years ago to realize that one human being owning another human being as property was wrong. And if you think about anything in history, think about that. Athens, the vaunted home of democracy, 1 out of 3 people were slaves. Thomas Sowell, in his great history of slavery, said Buddhist monasteries had slaves, Catholic monasteries had slaves, and they did.
Wow.
Virtually every religion had slavery. And this is just horrifying. So all of those stages are ones that you probably couldn't see coming if you were just thinking about the stages of growth that we go through. And most importantly, you can't see any of those stages by introspecting or by looking within or by meditating. Like, you couldn't look within and see that the second stage, when you took the role of other, you couldn't see that coming. And even when you were doing it, you didn't really have some sense of, oh, I see what I'm doing. I'm taking the role of other. That doesn't happen. And it didn't happen with third stage either. When we were rationally thinking, we knew what rational thought was, but we couldn't look within and see the structure that was creating this rational thought. And because we couldn't see any of these growing up stages by looking within, that had a couple of immediate results. One was that none of the great religions anywhere has any understanding of the specific stages of growing up. because they couldn't see them by looking within or meditating. And so none of the perennial philosophy schools has any idea of growing up. And that's a disaster. And so that was one thing. I started to build an integral map. And of course, at the center were the perennial philosophy waking up practices and traditions, Zen, Vedanta, Vajrayana, the cloud of unknowing, and so on. Those are all very important. But then outside of those was a circle of growing up, because this is very important. And you can get Satori's all you want, and you'll never be able to see a growing up stage. I mean, Satori, remember, can't even tell you that the earth is not flat. So, I mean, absolute truth tells us nothing about relative truth. It tells us about being, but nothing about beings, because the same being is present. There's not a different infinity on this side of the planet than there is on the other side of the planet. Right. It's the same infinity. And so that same being tells us just about being. It doesn't tell us anything about individual beings. So that was left up towards the other stages, like growing up. Because growing up measures is the finite. These are finite stages of growth. And by the way, this growing up process is probably best known from the work of Jean Piaget, particularly through the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. He revolutionized how education is done, because we realized that it went through these stages, and you could actually teach these if you knew what they were. And by the way, Piaget got his start from James Mark Baldwin. When Baldwin quit working at Harvard, he taught overseas at Paris. And he had many well-known students from around Europe come. And a young kid from Switzerland was one of his primary students, and that young kid was Jean Piaget. And so Piaget got most of his ideas from James Mark Baldwin. And even Kohlberg pointed this out. So that's growing up that I added. And then next I added what I call cleaning up. And cleaning up has to do most notoriously with Sigmund Freud and his inner circle, all of whom were geniuses, by the way. His inner circle was Carl Jung, Otto Rank, Alfred Adler, and Salvatore Ferenczi. I mean, they were all absolute geniuses. And that's the type of person that Freud attracted. His ideas, although there were several forerunners, but the way he expressed them and communicated them was so powerful that he just attracted the Carl Jungs and the Alfred Adlers and the Otto Ranks of the world. Interestingly, he broke up with Jung over this argument of mystical traditions, because he said to Jung at one point, "Promise me you'll hold on to the libido theory." And Jung said, "Why?" And Freud got very dark and said, "Because it protects us from the black mud of the black tide of occultism." Right. And Jung, in his memoirs, put, "What Freud didn't understand was occultism is everything that I was interested in."
Right.
But they never spoke after that conversation once.
Mhm. Mhm.
Freud was famously known for, a journalist once asked him, what does your new psychoanalysis do? And Freud famously said, where it was, their ego shall be. But most people don't know that Freud never once used the terms ego or id. Those are Latin terms for I and it, first person and third person. And they were added by James Strachey, his official translator, because he thought those Latin terms made Freud sound more scientific.
Oh, really?
So he added the ego and the id. But the terms that Freud used were the actual German pronouns for the I and the it. So Freud would never say that id can cause the ego enormous problems. He would actually write that it can cause the I enormous problems. And so what he really said with the famous quote was not where it was, their ego shall be, but where it was, their I shall become. And now that was very interesting because the it were the sections of the mind that were split off from the I into a second or even third person other. So it, or he, she, but predominantly an it. And what happens is that human beings have the capacity to split off sections of their own self, their own I, and push it into the unconscious. And when they push it into the unconscious, they'll frequently project it onto other people, onto he, she, or it. And my favorite example of that is a story I've told a lot, but I love it because it's a perfect example. But this is a test that was done just recently of certain homosexual men. And they selected homosexual men that were virulently anti-gay. They had spent their whole life trying to prevent laws that supported gays or something like that. But they just despised gays. And then they took this homosexual group that despised gays, and they actually showed them pictures of gay pornography. In other words, they showed them gay erotica. And 201, every one of the anti-gay homosexuals were more aroused by gay erotica than the average straight male was. In other words, they had a fair amount of gay desires themselves, but they projected them. They pushed them out from the I to the it, and then pushed this onto gay men. And then they tried to get rid of their gay impulses by getting rid of gay men. They shoved their shadow elements on the other side of their self and saw the shadow elements in people out there. We call that shadow boxing. And it's a very, very common thing. And what that means, it's a very hard concept to let in. Because what it means, on balance, is that all of the things we hate and loathe out there are things we first hate and loathe in ourselves. And despising them so much, we push them into the unconscious, and then that usually projected them onto other people. And that's why we see the things that we hate and loathe out there are really aspects of ourself. And it's very common that we'll project some quality like jealousy or envy or hatred or anger onto somebody else who already has a fair amount of that quality. We're not saying they don't have any quality, but it's an inviting hook for your projection. Because if you have a lot of anger that you're trying to deny, and you see an angry person out there, it's very easy to see all of your anger as being on them. And then what drives you crazy about them is they now have a double dose of anger. They have all of theirs, plus now they have all of yours.
Yours.
And so that's what drives you nuts. That's why you really will, talk about them, and you might dream about them, and it just drives you crazy. And it's this double dose that it's getting to you. So cleaning up adds to the wholeness of a human being, because whenever you take the things out there that you loathe and despise and bring them back and realize they're part of yourself, part of your own psyche, part of your own I, where it was their I shall become, then your I becomes bigger, because it's including aspects of itself that it had cut off. So this is another form of wholeness that we want to use, is growing up. Cleaning up.
Right.
So I was starting to add things like that to my original understanding of the power of the great mystical traditions. And I realized that as powerful as they were, they had no understanding of growing up or cleaning up, or aspects I would add and call opening up and showing up. But they didn't have any of those present. And that's why I had to start looking at my teachers, including were there aspects of cleaning up that they needed to do. And most of them were okay on growing up. Most of them were into at least rational or pluralistic. A few were quite far into integral, which is a quite highly advanced stage of growing up. But most of the founders of the great traditions, like Longchenpa and Shankara and the Bel Shinto, most of those people had reached an integral stage of growing up. They still didn't understand all the stages that led up to that, because they weren't aware of them. And they wouldn't be aware of them until about 100 years ago, as we said. But in terms of growing up and cleaning up, I had to reevaluate my teachers. And some of them did well, and some of them did not so well. But so when you catch me sort of tripping up a bit on saying bring everything to the path, there's a complete oneness, and then I sort of hesitate a bit, that's what I'm hesitating about.
Right, I understand. Well, Ken, it's just been fantastic to speak to you. You've gave a comprehensive, really a 360 on crazy wisdom, and it's so important because people don't understand it. It has a bad rep.
Yeah.
And it's just great to connect with you, and I thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Good. I'll see you again. Thanks, Ken. Be well.
Okay. Bye-bye.